Then yeah, we'll have Julian Marr from Robust Incentive Group at Ethereum Foundation to present us about the cost of permissionless liquidity provision in AMM. Please give a round of applause. Go ahead, Julian.
Okay. Well, thank you so much to the organization for having me and for all of you attending. Unfortunately, I can't be there in Brussels, but it looks like an amazing event and I have a lot of FOMO. But I'm happy that I can present this. So I'll be presenting joint work with Davide, and we're both at the Ethereum Foundation. And so this is the cost of permissionless liquidity provision in automated market makers, which is a recent paper of ours. So I won't bore you too much with an introduction to automated market makers because I assume most of you have this knowledge, but I'll just point out what's relevant for our paper. So currently about $9 billion is provided as liquidity in AMMs, and in the past 24 hours, the Uniswap LPs alone were paid about $1.5 million, which is a huge amount. And importantly, the fees are distributed pro rata to liquidity providers instead of what we see in traditional finance. So what this means is that liquidity providers that deposit capital into an AMM get some share of the total liquidity that's deposited. So it could be, for example, if you deposit half, you get half the weight of all of the fees that the traders pay, and the traders that interact with the AMM pay their fees in a way that you could abstract to somewhat separate cash flows. So the traders pay their fees proportional to how much liquidity providers have deposited into the AMM. And this is very different from in traditional finance, where most of traditional finance uses limit order books with price time priority. And I'll go through an example of how that works. So here you can see a limit order book. There's a certain amount of shares that people are willing to buy or sell at a given price. And I've given an example with two liquidity providers, A and B, and each of them has decided how many shares to give at each price and also what time they made their order. So for example, if someone were to buy 200 shares, what they do is they go to the limits order book and they see that I can buy 200 shares at a price of 10.1. And it turns out that these shares are all offered by liquidity provider A. So all of my fees go to liquidity provider A. If I were to sell shares to the limits order book, let's say I would be willing to sell 300 shares. It turns out that my best price in this case is 9.9. And what we see now is that liquidity provider A provided the liquidity before liquidity provider B did. So I first buy 200 shares from liquidity provider A because this is the best time, but it's liquidity provider A was earlier. And then I buy the remainder of my order, so the last 100 shares from liquidity provider B. So in this sense, 2/3 of my fees are going to liquidity provider A and 1/3 to liquidity provider B. Even though in a pro rata case, I would split my fees half-half amongst both of these liquidity providers since they pay both the same amount of fees. So from a trader perspective, I don't really mind too much where my fees are going, it seems like. And so AMMs and limit order books look somewhat similar. I just interact with the available liquidity in the market right now. From a liquidity provider perspective, it's completely different. And this is, of course, by design, because we designed AMMs to be computationally very lightweight so that liquidity providers don't have to update their quotes all the time, which is exactly what price time priority would incentivize for you to update your quotes as quickly as possible. So this begs the question, what are the economic consequences of the pro rata allocation of trading fees amongst liquidity providers? And here we'll focus on what are the consequences for passive liquidity providers, what are the consequences for liquidity traders using the AMMs, and how do these consequences affect future AMM designs? So our literature, our paper is related to literature in the following way. There are a bunch of papers looking at how liquidity supply is endogenously computed. And most of them focus on some various factors that influence trading costs, such as volatility, the trading fees that are charged, or whether there's concentrated liquidity or not. But they don't actually use the pro rata fee allocation rule as an object of study. More it's a modeling assumption. Our paper is most closely related to a paper by Agostino Caponi, which looks at just-in-time liquidity providers. Their results are again partially very much so driven by the pro rata fee allocation rule, but it's not an objective study. And we build on the loss versus rebalancing framework that Jason Medionis and his co-authors proposed. And they really decompose liquidity provider costs into arbitrage losses and market risk. For us, adverse selection is not object of the study. So it's easy to build on the lever framework and use the lever as the expected LP cost or a part of it. And we contribute to the literature on new AMM's designs that aim to minimize lever. And we'll show this at the end of the presentation. And also, our work is very much related to concave pro rata games, who introduce a family of games that have similar price of anarchy results, as I'll show you in a bit. So we contribute by showing that there's a welfare loss amongst liquidity providers that scales linearly with the number of liquidity providers. We show that there's an inelastic and elastic liquidity traders and how they complement each other. And finally, for this part, we show that the amount of liquidity is not always a good indicator of the welfare for all market participants. Then we show that lever minimization does not actually lead to a welfare increase for risk-neutral liquidity providers in our model. Lever minimization also doesn't necessarily reduce protocol concerns around MEV extraction, which is, of course, relevant for protocol designers such as Ethereum Foundation. So lever hasn't really been introduced yet. Maybe many of you already know about it, but it's when prices on AMMs become still because block times are 12 seconds. Liquidity providers provide their capital in 12 seconds, nothing happens. Prices on the external market move, meaning that there is an arbitrage opportunity. We limit ourselves to the lever framework because they provide a closed form solution for the amount of arbitrage losses, which makes it easy to incorporate into a model. And it turns out that other people, like Austin Adams at Uniswap, have a similar model setup. So this could be a nice way to model things going forwards. And we build on lever, which allows us to connect to the future of AMM design that tries to minimize lever. So our model is fairly simple. In the first period, we assume that there are n liquidity providers, and they each deposit an amount of risky asset and numeraire into an AMM. And their goal is to maximize their profits, which is their liquidity fraction. So what share of liquidity is provided by this liquidity provider, times the total amount of fee revenue, minus the lever or the total arbitrage, minus opportunity costs. And then for all blocks in a time interval after this first time period, we assume that elastic and inelastic liquidity traders arrive. There are a fixed number of inelastic liquidity private valuations, and they maximize their payoffs. So they could receive a private valuation because they have some private value for hedging their position. Maybe they need to deploy some amount of capital, but they don't have any information about what prices will do. And given this private valuation, that's different from the market price, they trade a certain amount that's increasing in amount of liquidity, which is why they're elastic. The solution concept is a subgame perfect Nash equilibrium, which by backward induction, and the number of LPs, the size of the inelastic demand, and the private valuation shorts are common knowledge to all participants. So the model could look something like this, where in the first period we have an LP that deposits, then arbitrageurs arrive, elastic liquidity traders arrive, inelastic liquidity traders arrive, and then there's a reverse arbitrage, which is more of a modeling assumption to ensure that prices at the end of the block are always the market prices. In for example, Binance. And then again, in the next block, the arbitrageur arrives, the elastic traders arrive, etc., etc. And this for some time period until in the last block, the LP withdraws. So the results that we see is that liquidity providers try to capture a portion of the inelastic demand. So we assume that at least there is a market. So the adverse selection costs and opportunity costs are not that big that liquidity providers are never willing to provide liquidity. And we also assume that they don't provide infinite amounts of liquidity. And then these liquidity providers compete to capture a portion of the inelastic demand. And the inelastic demand is a fixed pie. It doesn't grow if you provide more liquidity. Yet the only way to compete is by providing more liquidity because of this pro rata fee allocation rule. So this is what the passive liquidity providers do, is they provide more liquidity than would be optimal if there were no inelastic demand. So their liquidity that they provide isn't efficient at inducing demand. It's purely there to compete with other liquidity providers for a fixed sum. And then what we have is that the price of anarchy in this subgame of liquidity provision is linear in the number of liquidity providers, where the price of anarchy is given as the profits that a liquidity provider would make if it were to deposit the optimal amount of liquidity and it were the only liquidity provider, so a monopolist, divided by the profits of the n competing liquidity providers. And so these results are similar to the concave pro rata games literature, which show a similar price of anarchy results. Then for a full game, we consider the welfare of the elastic traders as well. And the elastic traders, of course, benefit from the additional liquidity because they can trade more and thereby increase their utility. So even without endogenizing the inelastic trader utility, which would be very difficult to do, we have the following, that the price of anarchy of the elastic liquidity traders and the liquidity providers is constant in the number of liquidity providers. And so you see that the welfare loss of the liquidity providers is completely masked by the welfare gain of the elastic traders. And even though the elastic traders aren't the ones inducing the game, where liquidity providers provide more capital than would be efficient, they are the ones to benefit. So the elastic demand creates more liquidity, which the elastic trader benefits. So in some sense, the elastic demand subsidizes the inelastic demand subsidizes the elastic demand. So now I'll move on to how our work can contribute to lever rebating or minimizing lever. So reducing lever is a big goal of AMM design. And the stated goals are to increase the profitability of liquidity providers and decrease the centralizing pressures that lever puts on the Ethereum protocol. There are centralizing pressures on the Ethereum protocol because lever is a huge source of MEV, and MEV leads to centralization of the validator set if we're not careful. And so our whole take here is that LPs don't care that much about lever rebating in our model, that is. So our model is very, very simple. It's the same as we just had, but we introduce a rebate parameter that resembles what fraction of lever is rebated to liquidity providers. You could think of this as the AMM hosting an auction for the rights to extract the arbitrage, and the revenue of this auction is rebated to the liquidity providers. And so the efficiency of the auction is captured by the rebate parameter. And our research question would be, how are liquidity provider revenues affected? And how is the total amount of MEV affected? And so what we see is that liquidity provider profits are not affected by lever rebates because the supplied liquidity increases as the amount of lever decreases. So here it's important to note that lever is the arbitrage intensity per unit of liquidity. And so if you were to decrease the amount of arbitrage intensity per unit of liquidity, so decrease lever, and the demand stays the same, then you effectively keep the same revenues, but you decrease your costs, which means that in principle, you'd say that you make more profits. But because of the pro rata fee allocation again, other liquidity providers see this and they want to capture a larger share of the profit. So what they do is they provide more liquidity, which means that the fee revenue is now split amongst more liquidity providers, and the amount of adverse selection increases in total because there's more liquidity that is subject to adverse selection. And we show that in this case, the profits of competitive liquidity providers are not affected by rebates of adverse selection costs if some condition is met. And this condition basically means that whether there's a rebate or not, there's in both cases a non-trivial market where there is at least some liquidity and not infinite amounts of liquidity. And this also has some interesting implications for the protocol because it means that there's also more MEV on the protocol than was expected maybe a year ago in the discourse around lever minimization. So it's not entirely clear to me that MEV and minimization at the application layer also necessarily decreases the problems that MEV causes at the protocol layer. So the intuition here is that if you decrease the arbitrage intensity per unit of liquidity, more liquidity flows in, as we have seen. And so the trade-off between these two effects isn't always clear, whether there is in total more arbitrage or less arbitrage. So this might be happy news for some of the searchers in the audience who I'm sure already know this. But But it's less good news for protocol designers because it means that, yes, we still have to worry about the centralizing pressures of MEV at the protocol layer, regardless of how efficient the application layer is, which is a challenging reality. So to summarize, the pro rata fee allocation means that liquidity providers deposit capital inefficiently, leading to a welfare loss that scales linearly in the amounts of liquidity providers. And we show that lever minimization doesn't affect risk-neutral liquidity provider profits, nor does it necessarily improve the MEV problems for the Ethereum protocol. Yet, very importantly, it does, of course, increase the welfare or the utility of the traders as they have lower trading costs. So that's a big gain that's definitely very necessary. So that was my presentation. Here are QR codes that you can scan for the full paper or for the slides if you'd like to. And thank you very much for hosting me again. And I'd love to hear any questions if you might have them. So maybe I'll
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for Julian. Give applause. Any questions from the crowd here? Yes.
Hi, Julian. Thanks for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I think I understand the general result, which is if everyone gets rebates, then no one gets rebates in a sense. So I guess like, as you know, someone thinking about incentives, or maybe I should rephrase or reintroduce the question. I guess maybe like, could you describe for, you know, some of us that aren't classically trained in, you know, econ terminology, like the differences between inelastic and elastic liquidity traders? Because I'm curious, like, how you guys view sort of thinking about incentivizing L2 or V2 LPs versus, you know, V3 LPs, and if that was taken into consideration when you were, you know, modeling these results.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. So we haven't looked at V3. This applies to V2. So I can't definitely say how this generalizes to V3. So V3, of course, does use the same fee allocation rule. So I would expect somewhat similar results, but that could be interesting to see. And with regards to the inelastic and elastic liquidity traders, in our model, it means that inelastic liquidity traders don't trade more if there's more liquidity in the market, whereas elastic liquidity traders trade more if there is more liquidity provided, and they do so because if there's more liquidity, your trading costs decrease. You could think of inelastic liquidity traders as people that have to, for example, deposit a certain amount of capital. Maybe they have to move out of a certain position. So maybe these people are very much constrained in what they can do by some exogenous source. Or maybe you're, for example, locked in on one blockchain and you want to move to the other. Elastic liquidity traders are different. They're maybe more pragmatic. Maybe they think they have a signal about price, but it's not clear that this is actually their signal. So if their trading costs are lower, they will trade more on your AMM. It could also be because elastic liquidity traders maybe use routers so that they route through different places where the trading costs are lowest. And then indeed, what drives our results is that if you decrease the costs, it doesn't mean that your profits immediately increase because of the equilibrium effect that more liquidity is provided, because suddenly there are more profits that I can take advantage of, if that clarifies it.
Yes, thank you. I'd love to maybe like chat with you offline about this, because I think that we're seeing on some layer twos that there are LPs that are where, you know, it's cheap to actually be an active LP. So this is an interesting sort of like thing to think about, you know, at least at the roll-up level.
Yeah, that is interesting. And also to add, we're looking at risk neutral liquidity providers here. It could very well be that your risk profile of an LP position changes if you're rebating lever. For example, you could imagine that the rebates or the auction works less well if there is a ton of volatility all of a sudden, and in times of less volatility, the auction works better. So this changes your risk profile. So it could definitely be that the profits in reality for liquidity providers change, partially because the risk changes.
Andrew?
Oh, can you hear me? Okay. Hi, Julian, Andrea Canidio here. Thanks for the presentation. I have a question. I understand how if you rebate some lever, you attract more liquidity, and then you may get larger rebalancing trades from arbitrageur because now the MM has more liquidity, and you call that an increase in MEV. It would be interesting to, in some sense, compare that to the increase on usage that you get from having more retail traders using the MM, because now it's more liquid and it gets less slippage, so on and so forth. Because in some sense, the problem with MEV, at least in my view, is the delta between building a plain block versus doing the whole super mega optimization that builders do. And you still have MEV in the form of, okay, you still have a large rebalancing trades. At the same time, maybe the vanilla block also becomes more profitable because you just have more transaction, pay fee. These are regular users. And it might be that delta shrinks, which ultimately, I think that may be the metric that is more relevant for the discussion about how the AMM design feeds into the infrastructure.
Yeah, thanks. That's really a great point. We should definitely do that. So to me, it feels like you're saying, yes, the total amount of MEV that stems from lever could increase, but the total block value increases as well. And so maybe we care about the percentage difference between local building and like the most sophisticated building at UQ2, instead of only about the absolute amount. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that was my idea.
That's a great point. Thanks.
I actually have one quick question, Julian. So I'm just curious, like if we were to have this like a rebates, would the would the elasticity of the liquidity and also the behavior of the inelastic traders change accordingly? Because right now, obviously, like we're kind of sort of assuming that they're basically behaving the same way that they are otherwise. But I'm just kind of curious. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's interesting. So currently in the model we assign private valuations to elastic liquidity traders, which is a bit of a modeling hack, because this private valuation then transfers into some sort of elasticity, and it's not really intuitively clear that these two should be the same, but it works out to about the same thing. So if now all of a sudden there's like a structural shift in how AMMs work, the question is if their elasticity would change as well. So for the inelastic liquidity traders, I think they won't change as much because they are simply inelastic, so their elasticity won't change. For the elastic traders, I think this could definitely be the case. Intuitively, to me, it feels that if your execution costs decrease a lot, at some point you don't care anymore about improvements because it's just very, very low. So you don't care about any percentage improvements anymore. If we will reach that point, I think that will be an empirical question and it will be very interesting to see. But I could definitely see their elasticity changing in that way, that maybe as your trading costs are a smaller fraction of your total costs or efforts that you expend, that you become less elastic.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions from the audiences here? We're good? We're good? All right. Then thank you very much, Julian. Give it another round of applause.
Okay.
Thank you, Julian.
Thank you very much.
We'll talk to you later, man. Bye.
Yeah, thank you so much. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Now, we're gonna have the third workshop